Stop sharing and then we'll begin. Hello and welcome to the second in our series of conversations about the Bible. Tonight, we're doing a reverse, so Frank will be interviewing me about my book, Approaching the End of Life. But before we do that, we're going to hand over to Will, who's just going to talk a little bit about the series itself, and then hand over to Frank, who'll start interviewing me.
Well, thanks everyone for joining us tonight on the second event of how the Bible can help us understand series of conversations that Virginia has arranged. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of the 4 books in the series that each conversation will relate around during the series. My name's Will. I'm from Darton, Longman and Todd, and we're the publishers of the books. The series is called How the Bible Can Help Us Understand, as you'll know, and some of you may have, some of this will be familiar to those of you that were on the call last week. But the series sort of was inspired by a quote from Pope Francis, and the quote goes, "The Bible is not a collection of books for the benefit of a privileged few. It belongs to those called to hear its message and to recognize themselves in its words." And the new How the Bible Can Help Us Understand series is designed to help us explore those words together today. It was inspired by the Revised New Jerusalem Bible, which was published by us in 2019. And that's Henry Wansborough's new translation and rendering of the text from both the 1966 Jerusalem Bible and the 1985 New Jerusalem Bible. There are 4 books in the series, 3 of which are available to buy now in pocket-sized paperback and also as ebooks. Last week, Frank Cottrell-Boyce and Virginia talked about forgiveness, which is the first one in the series by Frank himself. Today's conversation revolves around Virginia's book, Approaching the End of Life. Then next week, the 3rd book that's out now in the series will be discussed by Bernadette Meaden. It's called Illness, Disability and Caring. As you can see, they're all on a particular theme. Bernadette is a freelance writer who's contributed to many publications on political, social, and religious issues. In recent years, she's written extensively for Ecclesia on social justice issues, particularly welfare reform and its impact on the poorest and most disadvantaged members of society. And that will be next Wednesday's conversation, and that'll be between Virginia and Denise Cottrell-Boyce. And then on the final Wednesday, Wednesday the 27th, the 4th book in the series, which is to be released in July, entitled Welcoming the Stranger, will be discussed, and that will be a conversation between Denise Cottrell-Boyce, screenwriter and catechist, and Virginia, and that's on Wednesday the 27th. Each book in the series asks what the Bible has to say about an important aspect of our lives, hence the themes and the titles. Each book can be read privately or as part of a small study group, and I think they'll work well online as well. And most of our study guides that we sell at the moment would translate well to Zoom, which of course is what we're all up to at the moment. Each book is between 5 and 6 chapters. And the authors offer thoughts and questions for reflection, prayers and suggestions for considering the topic in question more deeply. The guides in the series are aimed at ordinary people committed in their faith and that want Christianly, but that are not necessarily, or who haven't necessarily been brought up in a Bible studying tradition. And we hope that they'll prompt intelligent thought, reflection, and guidance on some of the issues that really matter to us. And also conversation. And I'll hand you back to Virginia on that note.
It's me now, I think. I'm going to introduce Virginia.
Oh, sorry, Frank. Yeah.
So welcome. Thank you. If you were here last week, thank you for coming back. If you're new, you're very, very welcome. It's my pleasure and my honour to introduce Virginia tonight, who's written the book about death on a day when it just seems, well, a period when it seems kind of overwhelmingly relevant. We are surrounded by death. We have incredibly high figures at the moment. We're talking about this on the day of an execution in the United States. I'm bringing the tone down here a little bit. So I'd like to introduce you to Virginia. Virginia is a community activist. She's been active for 30 years, campaigning around community rights and social care. She's written 2 books already for Dalton, Longman and Todd, including the book that first made me aware of her, Reclaiming the Common Good, which I heartily commend to you. She's also written a novel, The Wave, which is not irrelevant to our themes tonight, and perhaps we'll come around to that. But we decided that this is how we're always going to start. We're going to ask you, Virginia, tell us about what part the Bible has played in your life before you wrote this book.
Yeah, well, I've been thinking about it because last week we both talked, you mentioned when I asked you this question that Catholic tradition is very piecemeal, and it tends to be very much at the fragments of the Bible we see through liturgy throughout the year and through learning the sacraments and little bits in RE classes. And I know a lot of my non-Catholic friends often laugh at my ignorance about the Bible. So my experience of the Bible had started in that sort of sense of that kind of fragmentary approach, but I also have other kind of ways into it. And I was thinking about this question all during the week, and I was reminded of my grandmother, who was widowed quite early in her life. She was in her early 40s, and she still had 4 school-age children, no job, no money, in the Depression, not a good time to be widowed. And my father described how she literally turned her face to the wall when my grandfather died and said, "I'm done with God," or something like that. She was very, very, very angry with God. And yet she was angry with God for a very long time, and yet she read the Bible every day. So there was something really powerful about that to me as a child. Like, what is it about this book that you're angry with the person this book is about, and yet you still read it? And I think she did in later life kind of make peace with God. But that was kind of my starting thinking about the Bible. And then as a child, I came across a sort of children's version, but it's sort of a mix between a children and adult version. It had some very strong line drawings, and it was about the Old Testament. It was the Old Testament stories. And I remember reading them avidly and being really, really interested in them. So that was kind of, I suppose, my first way in for myself. And then when I was a teenager, I was part of a prayer group, and that's when I encountered the Jerusalem Bible, and started to explore as part of a member of that group. When we were talking about subjects, as you know, what do I think about this? I will go and look it up what the Bible says. And so that's kind of how I've continued to interact with the Bible, really. And it means that I'm a sort of self-taught person, which means I have huge gaps in my knowledge and understanding, but there are certain passages and things I come to grips with. And the Jerusalem Bible sort of stayed with me throughout my life. So when it got revised, our friends Anne and Graham gave us this version, the New Jerusalem Bible, for our wedding, and that's our family Bible that has kind of seen us through many christenings and various family events. But then, of course, 2 years ago, DLT published the revised New Jerusalem Bible, which is this beautiful tome, and I was really excited to hear that, and really excited to meet Dom Henry Wansborough, who translated it a couple of years ago, and he told me all about how he went about that. So when I was asked to do this series, it was really a privilege and an honour to be asked to do this, and I have found that I have kind of learned come to know the Bible in a different way, not just from my own explorations, but from yours, Frank, and from Denise's and from Bernadette's. They've taught me different things. You've all taught me different things and made me look at stories afresh, and I've learned new stuff. So I'm hoping that that's what this Bible study series will do for other people as well.
Okay, that's great. So, I mean, this is how the Bible can help us to understand death. And it's really got 2 aspects. There's one, there's the fact of our own death, which, you know, is hard to cope with, and which we have to face that. And there's also the fact of other people's death. and how the Bible can help us to understand the act of mourning and loss. So let's begin by talking about confronting our own death and where we can find meaning in that. Because I think traditionally the English have been very bad at this. As someone with Irish connections, Irish people know exactly what to do when somebody dies. There's a whole etiquette and decorum around it, and there's an ease about talking about it. Whereas this is like a sweeping generalization, but generally in England, there isn't that culture around death. So how can the Bible help us to understand?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think that being a Catholic, I think, has helped me. I think generally speaking, I think it's not too. We're very stiff upper lip as an English community, and I think I've often envied the Irish kind of wake and that idea of kind of really celebrating life and death. And I think it's not just being English. I think it's something about Western world, and the as we've got more technology and we've kind of distanced ourselves from death, people die in hospitals away from us. They don't die up until COVID. They haven't been dying in our communities in the way that we've seen, and I think that's going to really be a sea change in this generation. But I think that's a technology, and also this drive to be perfect and to kind of be healthy and beautiful, and all of those things has kind of divorced us from the fact that actually the end of this life will end. It ends. That's it. It comes to an end. And I think there are really good reasons why we are frightened of death and we don't want to think about it. When I started thinking about this book, my starting point was that question: why are we so scared about it? And I think the first place is that we think we don't matter. And I started writing this book, I think in 2019, I think it was. And I remember going very early in the morning before work, because that's when I tend to do my writing, and picking up my Jerusalem Bible and just looking through the index, and I came across this passage from Ecclesiastes, and I'm just going to read a little bit of it because we are familiar with the first phrase in it, but I think it sort of really spoke to me. Vanity of vanities, says Koheles, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What profit is there for anyone in all that toiling under the sun? A generation goes, a generation comes, the earth stands firm forever. And I just felt when I read that, I'm here in the 21st century. Koheles, who's maybe a fictional character in the court, who was a kind of maybe a preacher in the court, he seemed to be saying something from over 2,000 years ago that I could really, really resonate with. What's the point of my life? It'll come to an end. It's so quick. It's over. And what happens to me afterwards? And there's no memory of me after I'm gone. And so that's kind of quite a scary thought. But that whole passage in Ecclesiastes goes on to sort of explore, what's the point of our lives. And he kind of concludes that really we have to grasp that God is with us. And he says, I know there's no happiness for a human being except in pleasure and enjoyment through life. So in a way, I think it's a kind of ancient version of seize the day, make the most of what you've got, because it don't last very long. And I found it incredibly comforting. I found it very, very comforting. So I think that was my first starting point, that was a very comforting thing. And then I think there's a fear of suffering. And we mentioned Job last week, and there's a lot of suffering in Job, but there's also a lot in the Psalms. And I think you mentioned last week, Frank, that the Psalms are kind of full of joy, they're full of anger, they're full of hope, they're full of suffering. And so there are a number of Psalms where people are bemoaning their lot, calling on God for help in sickness and suffering. And again, I find it doesn't give you an answer necessarily, but it's helpful to know you're not alone. This is a human condition, and this is something we perhaps all have gone through. And I think for us as Christians, we do look for hope in God, and the story of Job and that glorious hymn that you mentioned last week shows us there is hope and compassion and support at the other side, and God can be with us and walk with us. And then the final thing is kind of the fear of the unknown, and we'll touch on that later a bit about kind of what happens after we die. And again, there are passages in the Bible that kind of help maybe give us an idea where that might be. And then lastly, I'd sort of say that we celebrate a person, the life of Jesus ends with Jesus's death, but then moves on to the resurrection. And so there in the Bible is laid out for us, death is not the end, there is something beyond it.
That's great. I mean, one of the sections of the book that I really liked was about the act of dying and how the way we die can make meaning out of death. So you talk about the Passion, you know, which is like a huge chunk of each of the Gospels is the drama of Jesus's own death. And you kind of moved on from that to talking about martyrdom, but you also talked about Jane Goody. So do you want to tie Jane Goody and the...
Yeah, I think, again, I've been thinking about...
That idea that the way we die counts.
Yeah. I mean, again, I think the way we die, the way we talk about death can be really helpful. So before I go into Jade, I just wanted to ratchet back a little bit and talk about how other people can help us prepare for death as well. So in my own family, I think, you know, this whole thing about the kind of English being reticent about death, I think Catholicism that I've grown up with has been less reticent about death. So going to funerals was part of my childhood. Old great auntie so-and-so's died, there's a funeral, let's, you know, and let's go to the funeral. And, you know, the earliest one I remember was, it was exciting because I had ice cream and hid under the table, but there was something, I got something about this something important is happening here. But my parents were really free about talking about death, and my father always used to talk about 70 years and 10, which is also in the Bible, and the new translation does translate it as 70 years, and it's in Psalm 90 on human frailty, and it says that all our days pass away in your wrath, our years are consumed like a sigh. 70 years is a span of our days, or 80 if we are strong. And I think that sort of sense of there's a limit, it comes to an end, everything comes to an end. But if you talk about it, it can really be helpful. So that was in my personal life. But then I've had these kind of people that I've really admired in the way that they have dealt with death in their own life. So Jade Goody was a case in point, because, you know, when she came to our attention as a really uncouth, kind of gobby young woman on Big Brother, who got absolutely lambasted in the press as only a young working class woman could get, and I have to confess I wasn't that interested. You know, I didn't really like Big Brother after the first series. I thought it was a bit of an awful program, and I probably was as snobby as anybody else about Jade Goody, to be honest. But then something really remarkable happened in her life, which was that she got cervical cancer, and she was very young. And that's a terrible thing to happen. And not only that, but it was also terminal, and she didn't have very long after the diagnosis. But that was a point when I really changed my opinion of her, because rather than just hiding away in her lovely big house and just moping about it and feeling like, you know, that she had every right to feel very angry with the world and what it had dealt her, she was very brave and just came out and talked about it and became an ambassador for saying why it's so important to have screening, and regretting that she hadn't. But also she'd had a film of her last few weeks, and she let the cameras everywhere, and I was really struck because she said at the time, well, I've had my whole life on television, so I might as well have this, my death on television. And I was just like, wow, that's quite something. And I saw clips of it, and the one that really struck me the most was there was a clip where she allowed herself to be with no wig, looking really in pain and not beautiful, but just, you know, a really traumatic part of her illness, and begging to die. And it was awful. And in actual, we'll talk about euthanasia a bit later on, but it's the kind of thing that makes people say, well, you have to have euthanasia because it's so awful. And yet they also showed in the film her moving beyond that terrible day and having better days. And from what I understand, she died very peacefully. So I found that a very powerful, even if you know, you don't have to believe in God to be really inspired by that and say, well, it's possible to do this well, and to live with people you love, and to show that it's an ordinary, natural thing. And even when it seems terrible when a young person dies. So Jade Goody's death had a big impact on me. And then the other person is kind of the opposite end of the spectrum, I guess, was Pope John Paul II. Like many people, I was quite young when he came to Britain, and he, you know, so I remember being really excited about him coming, and he was that great communicator, and he used to go around his Pope Mobile, and we all knew him as somebody who could speak to a crowd and really work a crowd. And shortly before he died, he was in, I can't even remember what his illness was, but he was very, very frail, and he still insisted on coming to the balcony in Rome. And I remember watching him, and he could hardly get the words out, he could hardly stand. you kind of thought he was going to fall over any second. And I remember feeling, this is so painful to watch. And yet he was very deliberately saying, watch this. This is what it is. This is what death is. This is what comes to us all. And it's okay. And I'm okay with it. And I'm at peace with it. And that I found very helpful too.
Yeah, that idea that embracing that central fact of our lives creates meaning.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that I really, really liked that section. We're trying to kind of work through the chapters.
Yeah.
So the next chapter, you confront a very difficult thing, and it's turned out to be very apposite today because of what happened in the States to Lisa Montgomery, which is one aspect of what the Bible says about death is a very simple sentence, which is "Thou shalt not kill." But so is it more complicated than that on today?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely is. I mean, I think I particularly talk about euthanasia in the book, but I think just because of today and what happened to Lisa Montgomery and the death penalty, I think it's worth reflecting on kind of the more complex areas of it. Thou shalt not kill is obviously, I think it's a fourth commandment, and it's, as I noticed in the book, one of the very first stories you get after Genesis is Cain and Abel, and the murder. Cain murdering Abel and the mark of Cain, and Cain, you know, what Cain does is so terrible, he is expelled from the community. So there's a really, really strong message right from the beginning of the Bible that murder is wrong, and yet we know throughout history that hasn't stopped Christians from killing each other and finding excuses to kill each other. And so we have just war theory, and so I'm a pacifist, but there is a kind of religious argument that it's okay in certain circumstances to kill people. So there's kind of modifications of thou shalt not kill. And then the death penalty is another one. And one of the things I find really ironic in this kind of day and age is that some of the people who are really, really anti-abortion are really, really pro-death penalty. So on one hand, they're saying they, you know, that thou shalt not kill means you should not kill a child in a womb, but it's okay to kill somebody because they've committed a crime, even if, as I think the case of the woman who died today, she had I think she had learning disabilities, and I think there probably were questions about whether she should have even been tried for the offence that she was killed for. So I think there's a lot of you know, it's if it suits us to get round thou shalt not kill, we'll do it. And I think that's kind of, and I think that's, you know, Christians are not, they're not the only people, you know, they're not exempt from that. There are Christians who are very hypocritical about it, I think. And also people who think abortion is terrible, but are quite happy to go and kill an abortionist. I mean, what is that about? I don't understand that thinking at all. But in the book, I wanted to explore the concept of euthanasia, which I think is also very relevant, and it's become kind of more relevant in times of COVID as well, because there's this whole sense of whose lives are worth saving and whose lives are important. And we've been seeing that a lot. A lot of right-wing press have been suggesting, well, we can cope with so many elderly people dying of COVID just to get our lives back again, or people with underlying health conditions. That's kind of become a mainstream thought in the last year, and I think that's quite shocking, really. But behind that, I think, is a more complicated conversation, which is what do we do with the fact that we now live in a world where it's possible to live longer, but it's also possible to live longer with really complex health conditions that might have killed somebody off in childhood. It's possible to live longer with cancer. It's possible to live longer with a disability. And some of those disabilities and some of those illnesses, the end is not pretty and it's very painful. And so you've got that. And then you also have got, we've become a world that's become, the kind of individual rights have become more important to us than communal rights maybe 100 years ago. And as I think when I was growing up, euthanasia was a really dirty word, I think, because we were still the generation whose parents lived the war, and that was felt very, very, very real and very close to us, World War II. And people were still kind of caught up in the Holocaust. And I think as time has passed, and that sense that sick and disabled people were killed by the Nazi regime, Jewish people were killed by the Nazi regime, therefore euthanasia is a bad thing, has kind of receded a little bit. So I think there's all of that. And then you have to balance that against the fact that a lot of sick and disabled people feel very, very frightened in these times. We've seen a sort of horrendous austerity regime for the last decade that's really been damaging for sick and disabled people. Many people have died unnecessary deaths. And so there's a real fear about euthanasia among that community about, well, if the state could sanction my death, would it? And there's not a trust that the state would put the right safeguards in to stop that. So I find it a kind of a really important debate to have, because I think that rights of sick and disabled people for safety and security and to be in their lives to be precious is really, really important, and we can't lose sight of that. But equally, we have to have compassion for the people who we know are living if you have motor neuron disease, you kind of literally suffocate at the end of your life. It's a horrible way to die, and do we wish that on anybody? And if somebody wanted to make a good end, should I stop that? So of course I went to the Bible and sort of said, well, what does the Bible say about that? And it turns out not very much. So after thou shalt not kill, there's not much about kind of the boundaries of thou shalt not kill. So what I did find was one story, which is in Samuel, and it's the death of Saul. And basically what happened, there were two versions of it. In the first version, Saul is struck down in battle. He knows he's going to die, and he begs for his soldiers to end his life, and they refuse. It's not clear why they refuse, but they do. So he kills himself. And then the second version is in 2 Samuel, and in this version, there's an Amalekite who's a mercenary, and he says, I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, and there was Saul leaning on his spear, with the chariots and the cavalry bearing down on him. Glancing behind him and seeing me, he shouted to me. I replied, here I am. He said, who are you? I replied, I am an Amalekite. Then he said, come here and kill me. My head is swimming, though I still have all my strength. So I went over to him and killed him, because I knew that once he had fallen, he could not survive. Then I took the crown he had on his head and the bracelet on his arm, and I brought them here to my lord. So the Amalekite obviously thought he was going to get praised by David for doing this. He seems to have seen it as a mercy killing. But David takes a reverse action and just basically says, how dare you kill the king? He's God's anointed. And he kills him, which is, again, the hypocrisy of death. You can't kill the king, I'm going to kill you. And those two versions are often kind of quoted by people sort of saying that euthanasia is wrong. The Bible says euthanasia is wrong, and I'm not quite sure they're quite strong enough for that. I think in the first reading of it, Saul is able to kill himself, and in the second reading of it, it's not so much the mercy killing as the fact he's killed king is a crime. So I think it's hard to sort of say there's fast rules in the Bible for us. And I think also we have to, again, with many things in the Bible, things that happened and were relevant 2,000 years ago might not necessarily be relevant for us, because we have, as I say, people living longer with longer conditions. So then the second thing, I found a very helpful thing of a writer I know called Irena Tuffrey-Winner, who's a Dutch writer who I know from my time living in L'Arche community, and she writes a lot about people with learning disabilities, and she suggests that this conversation we need to have is kind of think about compassion on all sides. And so I thought, well, that's really helpful, because there's lots of compassion in the Bible. Jesus is frequently compassionate. There's lots of calling on caring for each other. So I think the sort of second part of this is sort of saying, well, whatever side of this debate we fall on, we should be compassionate with each other. And then I think the third thing that I thought when thinking about this was that actually, when it's so complicated and it's really not clear cut what we should do here, is maybe we should need to look for discernment. And there's a passage in Proverbs that I found very helpful. And it says, if you take my words to heart, if you set store by my commandments, tuning your ear to wisdom, open your heart to understanding, if your plea is for clear perception, if you cry out for understanding, then you will understand what it is the fear of the Lord, and discover the knowledge of God. For the Lord gives wisdom with his mouth, from his mouth issue knowledge and understanding. So I think that I find quite useful, because it's saying, well, let's just try and do this honestly and with love for everybody in these conversations, and find a way through it. And so one of the ways to do that, I had my brother's a Jesuit, and I asked a lot of people their views on things through this book, and quite a few Christians kind of said we don't know when I asked, and some people said, well, I could make a decision for myself. I don't think I could make it for another person. And what John sort of very helpfully said was, we have to kind of distinguish what we feel as Christians and what the state has a duty to do. So if the state decides at any point that it would change the rules on euthanasia, it's not our job necessarily. We might want to challenge that and do what we can within the public sphere if we think it's wrong, but it's not necessarily our job to do the state's job. What we have to do is love all the people that are affected by that. So if things change, so disabled people are more at risk, for example, that's where our compassion is. If things stay the same, then we need to have the compassion for the people who would like to die but can't. And I found that kind of a helpful way of looking at it.
I mean, one of the threads that pulls your book together is that quite a lot of human activity is around avoiding the fact of death.
Yeah.
Quite a lot of how we live our lives, trying to avoid the fact that we are going to die. But that meaning is ultimately rooted in that fact and facing that fact, so that even when God incarnated himself, he subjected himself to death, you know, and that therefore death became meaningful and sanctified by his death. And you pull that together really well, and I completely get that, and it's completely easy for me to embrace that. And your novel, actually, The Wave, is sort of about that, isn't it? It's that it's a group of people who are waiting for this tsunami to come and overwhelm them, and their lives become kind of more meaningful to them and make more sense to them as they wait for this to happen. The death itself is a kind of illumination, which has been a thread in culture. You know, if you look at any kind of classical painting, there's always a skull somewhere reminding you that if you forget that this is going to pass, then this will mean nothing.
Yeah.
That is the light where the meaning comes from. Easy. Okay, that's easy. Much harder to accept somebody else's death.
Yeah.
That you love. And one of the stories that you picked out, that kind of, and you're coming at it from a slightly different angle in your book, but the story of Lazarus is the story of, you know, some sisters who are with Jesus who just can't accept that their brother has died. It's just like, why? And that why is such a resonant why. And you've got a really lovely and very entertaining section about the ways in which we can begin to accept other people's death, and how the Bible can help us to understand not just our own death, but the death of others. And you've got great stuff about rituals and mourning. And
well, I think this was from a book that's just about to come out. So this isn't actually in the Bible, but I think it's kind of a reflection of. I'll come back to rituals in the Bible, but I think the story that you like, which is one I really like, is a story in the community in Tanah Toraja in Indonesia. And it comes from a book by Erica Buist, and it's called This Party's Dead. And it's coming out next month with Unbound. And Erica's story is basically that her father-in-law died very suddenly, and she and her husband were the people who found him. And they were quite young, I think in their sort of late 20s, early 30s. And it's quite because of what we were saying about you know, we in the West not knowing, not facing to death very much. They'd never had an experience of death before, and she's very funny about her own response to it, because her husband held it together, and she went into meltdown and became agoraphobic. And so part of her recovery from that was questioning, what on earth, why did I have such an extreme reaction to this? And her conclusion was, it's because we in the West are really, really bad at facing death. So what she did was she went around the world and she visited 7 different death festivals to see how other cultures did it, to see what we could learn from. And the one in Indonesia, in this community in Tanah Toraja, is quite extraordinary because basically they exhume their dead bodies every year, and they have a festival, and they dress them up in their favorite clothes, and they bring their conversations, and they put them around the table, and they eat there. It's like grandma's still in the house. And Erica actually had a picture of this family with their grandma all dressed up in her clothes, and she's FaceTiming somebody the other side of the world, and it's just remarkable and beautiful and funny and lovely. And one of the insights that Erica had was that this person was still alive, although she'd been 3 years dead. She had a social community beyond the grave. And yet in this country, sometimes when people are ill, because people don't know how to deal with ill, you can get cancer and experience a social death that people don't know how to speak to you, and you lose your community. So that's something she felt we could sort of learn from other communities. And I thought that was really wonderful. But I think when we had this conversation on Saturday, Frank, you mentioned a couple of really powerful things.
Because I was in Naples when Naples won Serie A, which is like the first time they'd ever won the Football League. And there's a huge, very, very famous cemetery in Naples called the Cemeterio San Gennaro. And in the run-up to the end of the season, someone had written, "You don't know what you're missing," over the entrance to the cemetery. And someone had written underneath that, "We're not missing anything." And the day after they won Serie A, like everybody in Naples went to the cemetery and took the bones out. They have condominiums, so it's not the same as, it's not like you're digging a body up, but they have these condominiums. So it was
and it's the same as the kind of Day of the Dead. I remember my sister sort of lived in Mexico. It's and she sort of said, you know, Halloween is just such a pale imitation of the Day of the Dead, because again, people bring favorite sweetmeats and drinks, and they sit and they talk to their grandmas and things. So I think that's something we can really learn from those cultures. But I think even within kind of within Christianity, I think we have those rituals. And one of the things I found really moving about Jesus's death is how Joseph and Nicodemus, who've been secret followers of him, come clean that they have been followers, so that they can take him down and give him the proper ritual. And we mentioned last week about that, the three wise men bringing frankincense and myrrh, the kind of the oil of death. And it kind of, I always feel a link between the kind of birth of Jesus and that death scene where they wrap him in the cloak and the white cloak garment, and they put the spices on, and it's kind of, it's a denouement of that story, except it isn't. But that's what it feels like. It's an actual end to that story. And I also wanted to mention, because you mentioned another very moving ritual that you had with Denise last year for the child you knew who died. You mentioned what you did in the church. It was very beautiful.
Should I tell that story?
Yes,
well,
please. Yeah.
That hunger. Well, first of all, just to refer back, I've always been very moved by the fact that at the end of the Gospels, that it's incredibly precise about the death rituals around Jesus. That act of mourning, and the people around him, you know, although he's God, still have to go through that process, and it's very precise about what that process is, and the cave and the anointing of the body, and it's still quite like what we do. And I was talking to you when we were speaking the other day about the fact there is the hunger to do that. And that is almost what defines us as human beings. That's almost like the break point. If there's a break point between us and the animal kingdom, it is that we bury our dead, and we feel that they are, or we have the capacity to feel that they're part of us. So we had this terrible thing happen this time last year, that a friend of ours lost a daughter very young, very, very suddenly. And they were away, they were in Italy. And when we found out, Denise just texted some people and said, we'll open the church if anybody wants to come. So she just went and she just opened the church, and we lit some candles and sat in front of the Blessed Sacrament and started to say the Rosary. And this was like at a couple of hours notice at the most, maybe. And what my memory of it is sitting quite near the front, and Denise saying, "Shall we say the Rosary?" And starting to say the Rosary, and suddenly realizing that the church there were dozens and dozens of people in the church at virtually no notice at all, just needing to be together somewhere that had been important to them, because it was a devastating piece of news. But that need to be there is the start point of all this. And that's a connection, isn't it? That's the connection to Lazarus' sisters, to Joseph of Arimathea, to Mary, to everything that happens in that amazing drama. You know, your book is How the Bible Can Help Us to Understand Death. The Gospels circle around the fact of the death of Jesus. That is a huge kind of pivot in those books, I think. Yeah. And anyone can think their way back into that, because we've all had that.
Yeah, and I think the other thing I just want to say before we go to kind of the last question is that I think what that then helps us do, that's a starting point of the mourning period, it's, you know, that ritual sort of centers us, brings us together as a community, gives us a sense of we're not alone in our grief. And then we have to go off and do the very, very hard job of grieving, because only each one of us has to do that on our own. We can't do that together, but we need to come together to say we're just starting, in the way that you talked about forgiveness being the start of a journey. The death is just the start of a journey. The funeral is just the start of the journey. And it's kind of, in my experience, it's quite a complicated journey, and it's different for every person who's experienced the grief, but it's also different for every mourning. Every death I've had, I've felt experienced differently.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, I think that's my favourite chapter in the book, actually, because it places the Bible within that thing of, you know, that very human thing of struggling to come to terms with this. So we're starting to get questions already. So Kate has pointed out that some birds partner for life and are known to mourn, and that is true. Mourning isn't all that much. This thing about like how we commemorate death is very complicated to me as well, because we went to see the Jade Army last year, and there's a fear of death in that memorializing as well. Or if you look at the pyramids, it's that like we're prepared to kill to make my death bigger. So that slaves were brought in and people died making the work, and so that is quite complicated. Very much part of the. And Kate has also said what you referred us to the Good Grief Conference last year. I don't know.
Yeah, I've heard the Good Grief. Yeah.
Okay. So if people want to put up questions in the chat now, I've asked a question about each of the chapters, but if people want to put any questions in the chat, and I tell you what questions we've had already, we haven't had any questions yet at all.
While we're doing that, I just think it might be good to kind of just to kind of conclude about the kind of, you know, the what happens after death as well, because that's an interesting point to me, because we don't
central point.
but no, we didn't know we'd have time for this one, but I think we have got a bit of time, so I'm jumping in. So in terms of kind of approach at the end of life, that's kind of it's a question that I'm really interested in, because in a sense it's not something we can actually answer, and it's not something that the Bible answers very well either, because the earliest, when I was reading the Ecclesiastes earlier on, when I looked at the kind of the notes in the Bible, the Jerusalem Bible, there wasn't a sense of heaven and hell at that point in the Jewish tradition, and it came a bit later. So by the time Jesus was born, there was a sense of heaven and hell, but there's not a sense of what that actually looks like. And obviously we live again in a world which is much more scientifically based. So the kind of the heaven and hell that my parents grew up with kind of hell being a sort of fiery pit and heaven being this perfect place, and there's a gulf between. That's no longer with us. So we have these kind of images. There's kind of images of kind of the feast. I think it's in Isaiah, and Thessalonians says, God will bring with him those who've fallen asleep in Jesus. Well, that's very nice, but what does that actually mean? What does that sound like? And Revelation says he'll wipe away tears from their eyes, death shall be no more, and crying and pain shall be no more. But again, there's not a sort of, it's all image and it's all nice pictures. Yeah. We don't know what it is. And there are sort of two things I was thinking about when I was thinking about the chapter. First of all was that while we're trying to work out what death might look like, science is trying to sort of say, well, we think we can create life after death without a God. And so we were talking about transhumanism last week, and the idea that there are a lot of people in California who think this is going to happen and are working towards it, that we will eventually want to upload our consciousness to the cloud and merge with AI and get rid of these terrible bodies. And in a way, it's like an eternal life, but it's an eternal life within a machine. And it's one that's kind of reliant on technology continuing and us having enough energy to carry on. And it's also probably instilled in kind of having a lot of wealth to be able to do it. So it's not necessarily in the equal kind of heaven.
It's actually very like the Jade Army or a pyramid.
Yeah. It's our modern version, maybe.
It's a dealing with death that is about fear of death.
Yeah.
They to deal with death, and
so
after death, I will still be really powerful.
Yes. And so I will leave with the kind of more helpful interpretation, which I read in a book called Blue Sky God by Don McGregor. And he was talking how the idea of quantum physics has this idea that when we die, our consciousness just carry on beyond us and is kind of absorbed into the universe. And he describes that as Christ consciousness. And so he has a sort of way of science and God kind of merging together. And so it's I think it's a more helpful view of science and theology. And again, not quite clear what that looks like, but it feels more hopeful, and there's some sense that God is with us.
We've got two questions. One is from William and Lucy, who say, are there any Bible passages that you feel particularly appropriate to helping us come to terms with sudden death?
Well, I think that's really interesting, because I did do a little section on sudden death, and I asked people I had various people throughout the book that I asked, kind of vicars and religious and non-religious people, their experience of death. And somebody did talk about a funeral they had done for somebody who had died, and the importance again of the ritual, because it was so sudden, and just trying to bring a kind of meaning and get a sense of this person's gone, but they're still with us, because we've got to kind of process the fact they've gone. It's happened so quickly. That person didn't kind of come up with a reading, but when I was thinking of it, I actually thought the death of Jesus, because it's very sudden, it's very unexpected for the apostles. They think they're following this great leader, and then suddenly he's whipped away from them, he's taken off and tortured, and then dies this public agonizing death on the cross. And so I know it's quite a harsh death, but I think I find it a very helpful in thinking of the sudden loss of somebody, because it then leads to the resurrection. But the other sort of passage that people have talked about a lot, when I asked about what passages help when somebody's dying or is dead, was Psalm 23, "And the Lord's my shepherd," and that's the sense of the Lord taking us and walking with us in pastures green. And so that's the other one I would mention.
And just as well, that Jesus grieves.
Yeah,
he's sad about that, and that it is part of the natural order of things, and it is that that he's been there and he's had that experience too, that it is part of the wholeness of ourselves. I've just missed a question. Hang on a second. Kate has asked, how much theology is in the book?
Well, I'm define theology. I'm not a theologian. The purpose of this series is really for people who aren't necessarily Bible scholars to just engage with the Bible, so that we can all engage with the Bible. So this is very much me as a kind of a Christian, kind of saying, well, I'm interested in this aspect of this topic. What's the Bible going to teach me? So if that's theology, then it's very much my version of theology, but I don't think it's particularly formal in terms of it's not formal in terms of any formal training.
No, I'm not a theologian either. Denise is a theologian, but I'm not a theologian. Yeah. So I think there's one theologian on the list.
One out of the four of us.
4 of us. But for me, it was like an opportunity to engage with the Bible itself off the back of your human experience. So it's really about readings, isn't it? It's about reading of the scriptures. There's no attempt to kind of present an historical context for them or anything like that. It's called How the Bible Can Help Us Understand. And I think for each of us, probably except Denise, it's been a journey of understanding, that of discovery. My experience of writing the book was that nearly everything that I thought I knew was not quite right. Yeah. And that what I discovered was richer and more complicated than.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things I found with exploring it from this point of view, is that richer and more complicated, and that nothing's quite straightforward, and that's right, because life isn't straightforward. And so I think if you're looking for a guide to kind of give us an absolute right or wrong answer, that's not necessarily the way forward, but it's a kind of can help us discern things.
There are no more questions at the moment, so I'm going to ask you to do the recommendations, because one non-theological aspect of the books is that we've tried to kind of look outwards from the Bible as well. Oh, sorry, hang on. Can you, from Edel Ray?
That's a really good question, Edel. I would sort of say.
Shall we read it out just in case people haven't seen it? As
opposed to sudden death, can you think of any Bible references to the experience of palliative care? Yes, I can, because I've accompanied 2 people who very close to me who died both of breast cancer, secondary breast cancer. My very dear friend Pip, who was one of my oldest friends, one of my first adult friends really, and she died just short of her 49th birthday in 2010, and then a few years after that my mother died of secondary breast cancer, so in 2014. And so but I accompanied both of them in very different ways. Pip's was kind of, she was a bit distant from me, so and I had small children, so I couldn't be with her life, but we used to kind of share stuff and text stuff. So with Pip, I just literally would read something and say, oh, I found this helpful, or so we'd sort of share stories. And I can't particularly remember a particular reading for Pip, but I do remember we had conversations about the Bible, and it kind of often came from her. And I think one of the things I learned with Pip dying was the dying person leads the way, because it's their death, it's their illness, they're in charge as far as I'm concerned. And so if something's helpful to them, then let's go with it. And then with my mother, it was slightly different, because she was living with my sister, and again, she was at a distance, but I was able to kind of, my children were a bit older, and I was able to go a bit more often. And I used to be, my sister was the main carer, and I was, when I went, we all took turns, there's lots of us, so we were able to rotate. And I was a secondary carer. And one of the things I found with my mother that I found, and I think it's, we'll touch on this next week in illness, caring and disability, is actually, it's very difficult to change the relationship from mother-daughter, particularly having an immensely capable mother who was a nurse, and to suddenly happen to be in a role of being her carer. I found that very, very difficult switch. And I've been a carer in loads of settings, but I found caring for my mother the hardest caring job I've ever done. And I didn't have to do it very much, and I wasn't the main carer. I just had to turn up a few times and help out. And one of the things I found quite difficult was in the last couple of weeks of her life, she she did speak, but she didn't speak very much, and she spent a lot of time with her eyes closed because she had a brain tumor pressing on her eyes, and she was tired and she couldn't keep her eyes open. So I'd be sort of sitting with her, but it kind of, we had a very chatty conversational relationship, and suddenly I couldn't be that chatty conversational person with her, and it was just, I was forced to sit with her. And I knew she loved the Bible, and I just couldn't do anything. I had days where I just sat with her and I didn't do anything, and I felt really helpless. And then one day I just thought, I'm going to read the readings of the day, because I know she'd like that. So I got the missal out and I started reading, and I read the Psalm, "Oh God, our love has rest on us as our hope has rested in you." And as I read it, she just sat up and joined in the psalm, and I was just astounded, because at that point she had hardly any speech, and it was very beautiful. So I found that reading very helpful.
And I think part of that is just the pure familiarity calls out to something fundamental in it. I mean, I have, my father has dementia and he's quite far gone at the moment, but if I read the Psalms out, he will often recognize, and often, or prayers, or bits of the Mass or anything like that will penetrate that fog in a way that really nothing else does it anymore. There were times a few months ago when football would have done, even if it's gone away now. But the rhythms and the cadences of prayer and psalms, they rest very deep, and I think they're answering something in us. It's not just memory. How essential is the idea of an afterlife, asks you, if not an old-fashioned idea of heaven and hell, to our thinking about death, because nobody seems to talk about it. It's true, but nobody ever, like that. When we were talking about Lazarus there, and I do always, as a writer in particular, find it extraordinary that Lazarus comes back from the dead and no one says, so what was it like? Very smelly, that's it, So, well, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a really interesting question. I think we're kind of a bit embarrassed to talk about it. It is also because, as I say, I don't come up with any very concrete answers, because I don't think there are any. I think Jesus died and rose. Jesus told us there'd be a place for us with his Father at the end of our lives. But what does that actually look like? We can't imagine. And whether it's actually, is it our physical bodies? Well, probably not. There's no evidence to suggest that. So that's why I'm kind of drawn to these ideas of consciousness and passing on of consciousness. But it is, who knows. And the other thing that I kind of said, and I actually put this in the wave, was, it's kind of, the last joke will be on us, because we might all be wrong and there might be nothing, and we won't know till the last moment, and we won't ever be able to tell anybody. But you have the faith that there is something. I like to think that there is something, and I guess I have always loved the grain of wheat and the idea, you know, unless a grain of wheat shall die, and you'll have new life, and the importance of the grain has to die for the new life to come, and what that new life looks like might be very different. So that's not really, yeah. With the end in mind, I've just noticed in the chat. I know Catherine Mannix's work, and I think I mentioned. I think that's one of the recommendations I put in the book. But I know if anybody hasn't followed Catherine Mannix, she talks about death and beautifully, and grief. She's a very good writer, and she's wonderful.
We're always going to end these talks by talking about other cultural references, and I think one place to start is the fact that there is very little about afterlife, and culture's made up for that ever since. Huge amounts of like, we could talk about Dante. I could talk about Dante all day, but the new Pixar release is Soul, which is also about the afterlife, which is based on Match of Life and Death, which is also based on. I'm interested in the fact that Soul has come out now, and Match of Life and Death came out during the war, and suddenly we are surrounded by death, and we try to imagine what comes next.
Yeah.
Before just let me just check the last questions. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to riff off that, just that that also that there's two other sort of series that I can think of that's happened that actually. So although I think we maybe don't talk about it culturally, we do, because the this sort of Life on Mars and Ashes to Ashes series. You know, when you started off, you didn't know what that was about, and then it clearly was about life after death, but it kind of seemed to end. The Life on Mars series ended with a lot of questions, but the Ashes to Ashes series made it absolutely clear. Yeah, this is about purgatory, and this is about getting to heaven and avoiding going to hell. And it was I just found the last Ashes to Ashes absolutely extraordinary. But at the same time, there was Lost did a similar sort of thing with their final series, and then recently we've had The Good Place, so which my kids have got into. I haven't really got into it, but that's kind of that's supposed to be heaven, but actually it's hell pretending as to be heaven. So it's kind of interesting. So, yeah.
And if Groundhog Day isn't about purgatory, what is it about? But picking up on your theme, I think, well, The Wave, I'll mention again. That's about how death. It's only death that really imbues us with meaning, and if we avoid it, we're just escaping meaning and truth about ourselves. Which is also they're beautifully laid out in a fantastic book, a story called The Immortals, which is about some people who are immortal and therefore never have to make any choices because they can just do anything, everything. Nothing damages them, which is sort of how it works out in Groundhog Day as well. Yeah. And it's that thing about only choices, only saying no to things makes your yes valuable. And it's only the shortness of your life that makes eternity have any kind of meaning at all. So I recommend that. And talking about what the afterlife is like, absolutely amazing thought experiment. It's by the American neuroscientist David Eagleman. I don't know if people have come across him. He wrote a fantastic book called Sum, as in ego sum, which is like 40 or 50 different ways to imagine what an afterlife would be. And one of them you really made me remember when you were talking about how in certain cultures it's possible to die before you die because people stop talking to you because you're ill, as opposed to other cultures where you carry on being part of the community after you're dead. There's a really great one where you can be in heaven as long as people remember you. And if they stop talking about you, you go.
Oh, wow.
So that's just, I mean, they're like 2 pages each, but they're really wonderful.
Yeah.
What else was on my list? No, that's my list.
Yeah.
Oh, a wonderful film. I can just recommend it because it's beautiful and wonderful. By one of my favorite directors, Japanese guy, Koreeda. He made a film called Afterlife,
right,
which is about the transition into the next life, where you have to choose your favorite memory.
Wow.
To go with you, and you take your favorite memory with you, and it's just beautiful.
Oh,
what happiness is.
Yeah, that is beautiful. That's a lovely sort of thought. The other thing I just want, well, the things I wanted to flag up. I mean, I've mentioned a couple of them already, but Erica Briest's book, This Party's Dead, because, as I say, I think it's really moving, it's really funny, but I think she's doing something really, really important for now and really helpful, I think, in this world we're living in. And I think the other one I wanted to mention, which is another one that's coming out, is a friend of mine, Anne Booth, who writes for children and adults. But this is one of her crossover ones, because it's a picture book, but it's really a picture book that adults would appreciate too. And it's called Shelter for Sadness, A Shelter for Sadness, and it's illustrated by David, I want to say Lickstein, but I'm not quite sure his name. But it's he's a beautiful, beautiful illustrator, and that's coming out next week on the 21st. So actually a week tomorrow. And it's basically the idea of looking after your sadness in your life, whatever that sadness would be, and honouring it, but living with it rather than trying to hide it away and pretend it doesn't exist. It's very beautiful. So that's another thing. And then I wanted to mention two bits of music actually, and I was thinking, we were talking about the skull in the corner, and I think this piece of music, this video does this, which is Johnny Cash's Hurt. Which is just an astounding video if you haven't seen it. There's Johnny Cash at the end of his life, probably a year before he died. His wife died a few months after they did the video. He sits in a kind of a table kind of full of rotting food, and there's a skull in the corner, and basically saying, you know, I've had all this wealth. And they show the kind of pictures of him in his youth and his beauty and his wealth, and he's saying, this is it, it's over. And it's beautiful. And then the other one was, we were talking about on Saturday, was David Bowie, Lazarus, which was released on the day he died, and has the line on the day he died, this is what happened. And it was him basically imagining what was going to happen on his death day. And again, it's a very powerful video.
Right. Okay, so next week it's Bernadette's, isn't it?
Next week it's Bernadette's, so it'll be me and Denise talking about Bernadette's book on illness, disability and caring, which again has become really, really vital in COVID.
Subjects, yeah.
Really, really important subject.
Zeitgeisty, and from someone with huge insights and authority into the subject. So
yeah,
really, you should definitely turn up next week.
Yeah. And thank you for coming. Thank you all for coming. And thank you, Frank, for interviewing me this week and being my interview guest last week. And Claire for videoing, and Will for your comments. We look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Virginia. Okay. Bye, everybody.
Bye.